Hello, I'm Chris Blask. I'm the Vice President of Strategy with Cybeats. I'm in an Airbnb in Orlando on my son's computer. So if anything's not working, it's my fault still, I'm sure, at the end. And with me today is Jabs, Danielle Jablanski. Thanks for joining us today. Where in the world are you and how are you doing?
So I'm in Dallas, Fort Worth. Arlington, Texas is what I call home now, even though I've moved every 2 years. So it's pretty hard to keep up with me. How are you? I don't think anyone asks you that on the show.
Oh, well, I am good. Yeah, it's been since this series started. This is episode 25, I think. This is the first one I've done on dry land. Yeah, I've been building and sailing at the same time and living on a set of boats that I've sailed 150 miles and are now nestled in Tavernier in the Keys, up near Key Largo.
So you can't talk about any of the sharks you're seeing out and everything else today?
No sharks. But I'm in Central Florida, so we have alligators. Any ditch, any wet spot on the ground, you see a damp piece of sand, there's probably an alligator in it.
Yep. So. Yeah, keep me away from that. We did spend the weekend last weekend in Arkansas, pretty rural outside of Little Rock, and did some hiking and canoeing, and we loved it, and you would have loved it. It was beautiful.
Yeah, we lived once upon a time in East Tennessee on Douglas Lake, east of Knoxville, the Smoky Mountains, and that whole part of the country is just bloody amazing.
Yeah, perfect weather too. So.
Right, and so we're here arguably for to talk about these cybers things and all this stuff that we do, and and looking at your background and the topics we've covered so far, I don't know how many Dirk Gently references I've made, so far, but everything is connected. It really is.
Yes.
From as you say, the first work you did in Rwanda, nuclear policy, all these different things, and you're at Nozomi now. So I've watched that over the last decade. Now we have visibility. We have industrial systems that can actually see what's going on in their networks. Surprise, surprise. And established companies like Nozomi and competitors in your field, that are creating real awareness that just didn't exist whatsoever, 10 or so years ago. So as we were discussed before before opening up here, we tend to look back, try to figure out, where we've been, how we got here, look a little bit at the present, since we're here, we need to do things. This is always the window we have to do things. And then guess a little about the future. So Anthony, if you would pop up that first question, which was, okay, so looking at your background, right? Openness and honesty. That's really what all this stuff is about. I mean, the internet itself, I've watched it go from, the internet itself can't work. Bill Gates said this, nobody will use the internet, but the Microsoft network, will be the place. AOL, the walled gardens. And the very idea that just a randomly self-assembling global network, will be how we do all this, and down the line with open source. Open source 20 years ago is, nobody seriously is going to use open source in real business. It's literally impossible to find any code anywhere, that doesn't have open source in it. And if you don't have awareness in that, maybe that's a problem. We're all wrestling with that now. So when I say our, as I say in the lead up to this, we're basically, part of this centuries-long exercise in free speech, democracy, capitalism, self-assembling structures, right? So is it, from a technical perspective, anyway you want to go with this, the openness and honesty, has it always been our strategy? Is that our fundamental core, or is it an emergent property we're trying to engineer now?
Okay, I like the question a lot. A lot of catch-22s, like you mentioned. The democracy experiment, I think, has a bit of a pendulum swing all over the world. And I think that extends to how we use free and public spaces. So that pendulum also kind of extends to where we're at with technology. What's really interesting to me is that given any focus on transparency, there's usually this assumption that there are kind of byproducts that come with transparency. And those byproducts are typically truth, trust, and justice. And I think those are not necessarily true when we look at transparency, right? So you can have something that's open, transparent, obvious, open source, collaborative, community-based, right? And you kind of get the tragedy of the commons in some situations. And in other situations, you get really good ideas that have provenance value, security value, and kind of to where I am now in my career, looking towards early warning and detection tools that we wouldn't have thought of in ICS 20, 30 years ago, because we were still trying to get people on board to have visibility, right? So it just depends on kind of the words you use. But I think your question, the first word that came to mind when I read your question was, what are the byproducts? Are those assumed byproducts, or do they actually require work? And I think they do, especially justice, right? Justice is not a natural byproduct of truth, even in kind of the criminal situation and investigations. And something you talked about with Scott, I think he mentioned some things around like law enforcement and investigations at one point in his conversation. And it reminded me of a podcast I listened to where a prosecutor was talking about his client who was he was on trial for murder by hire. So he was doing the hiring. And there was a text message between him and the apparent murderer saying, hey, the cops just gave me a visit. They're going to be checking our communications, cover your ass, right? And the prosecutor said, well, if somebody just picked up that phone off the street, they wouldn't think this was a murder for hire plot. And that was his argument. And I was like, yeah, but that's not the trial that we're in, right? That's not the context that the text messages are being reviewed in. And I think we forget a lot of those context cues when we talk about technology, democracy, open source, shared platforms, community initiatives, and things like that.
Right. And the catch-22s, caveats, right? The sweeping generalizations can be true. I'm on record, I'm betting sort of my whole life and society, my work with society, that we're right. That on average, by and large, groups like the U.S. founders are right. And arguably the French Revolution, but anytime I mention them, guillotines, we're overdone. Really clear, right. Way too much of that, happy. But again, it's even that is an example of the lack of nuance, lack of understanding the catch-22s, right? Yep. These are complex, not just systems, complex human systems and sociological systems, right? Mm-hmm. What we call justice, we invented what justice is. We get to define it, and then as we do, as engineers or social engineers or whatnot, is hack that, try it, refine it, work on policies.
Yeah, and stop overcrowding prisons, right?
Stop overcrowding prisons. How's that war on drugs working out? We really.
That's a different podcast.
$200 billion a year, yes. For only $200 billion a year will not affect the problem in any positive way. But so we're here today, and this is. So Anthony, if you could put this one up, appropriate transparency. And we're talking about this sort of thing, and I've seen this before with threat intelligence. We can't possibly have threat intelligence because then we're telling everybody everything and we're giving all our IP to everyone, and we can't have, nice things. Mm-hmm. And it turns out we can, but you're not always giving everything to everybody. And in supply chain, same sort of thing happening all over again. Software bill of materials, that's my secret sauce. I'm not, if I can't control that, I can't have a company, which is true. And since we're a little more sophisticated these days, with a couple of decades of practice at this, we can say, all right, well, but maybe you can give a certain amount of it to the people you're already giving information to, your customers, your partners, the people you have contracts with, and have existing policies and ramifications and repercussions. Maybe you can build that. And but again, I'm deeply inside this. I'm biased out of the teeth. I think the answer is always yes, right? But maybe it's not now. Maybe these things are playing out 3, 5, 7, 10 years from now.
Yeah.
But from any angle you want to take it, but appropriate transparency. Being better next year. You're working today to be better at next year. Is that a thing, or is it a small group of people working on something that's not quite here yet?
Yeah, I actually love this question because Nozomi has been focusing on this quite a bit lately, and we really look at what can we do in terms of leading the community at a point in time where people are paying attention to the technology that we care about and its impacts in the real world, and what can we keep proprietary, right? What's the secret sauce of our product and how we use it? And a lot of the times it comes down to data. We realized a long time ago with network monitoring, you could accumulate a ton of data, but if you couldn't do anything with it and you couldn't translate it for the operators or for the SOC, analysts, then it was just congratulations, you've got a bunch of data. And I know that your field struggles with this in the SBOM world, but for me, this might not be a popular opinion, but I'm really over awareness and hygiene, right? Now that we know that we're not going to break any industrial systems by doing some of the passive detection work that we're doing, how do we move towards early warning and meaningful detection, right? I can set alerts all day that tell you that the sky is blue, But if it's not a meaningful detection, then what am I really selling you? And I think it's that early warning piece is the real important part of appropriate transparency. And then that also means that appropriate should be defined by how centralized or decentralized the ownership is of meaningful information. So I know you talked a lot about the ISACs as well on your last call. And I think it's really interesting in the framing of this conversation. You talk about society. Society is decentralizing and ownership is decentralizing, right? A long time ago, if there was a monopoly, that monopoly was going to stand for 20, 25 years. Today, that's not the case when you look across platforms and access and ownership of technology. So I think the appropriate definition in your question really comes down to decentralization. And some people are like wild on this right now. Like there's entire podcasts, right, about how, the global arena and nation states and bipolar power, all these things are going to be in the future. But I think in technology, it's more apparent that decentralization is at least the next 15 to 20 years of what we're going to see. And people want meaningful and actionable information, not just troves of transparency of data.
Well, right. And even just in the individual cases, I think on this show, maybe but I mentioned the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland. I love them because, working with Mehdi Antazari and Unisys team and them over the last couple of years on the DBOM thing and the attestation ecosystem thing, where it's not about software bill of materials. You look at a Boeing airframe with Rolls-Royce engines in it sold to a nation state, and one day one of the blades breaks. Can I track back? Can I put in the contract language that in the future, should this happen, you will, my supply chain, give me the software that was running on the machine that made that blade, that individual blade? And the answer is yes, you can do that today. You can put that in place. I kind of think it's, that's inevitable. But that begs the question of, now, if I asked you to give me all that information in advance, how much is that? It's like, are you kidding me? What attestations do you want in a case like that, right? This is a military vehicle we're talking about. I want to know the software that was running on each machine tool that touched every single piece of metal, who was operating the machine tool, what day it was, where the metal came from, the temperature, and. Could you just imagine compiling all that information, delivering it with an airframe, and you have a nation state that's got enough issues because they just accepted this large capital equipment they need to integrate into their physical infrastructure, and we're going to give them an exabyte of attestations about things they'll never need.
Yep, attestation and provenance, right?
Right. So it's got to be not only is, because as usual, as security people, I think we come at this from the wrong direction sometimes, like because we're worried about the security aspects of it, but just practically, right. Does Boeing want to capture all that information? Will their customers actually have a place to put it?
Is it digestible? This came up recently. I listened to, it was a cybersecurity talk at a conference, but it was on NERC-CIP, and I think it was NERC-CIP standard 13. Don't quote me. And I thought it was going to be supply chain cybersecurity, and it really was provenance and attestation of where the parts come from for OEMs and how they get resold and integrated, right? So how they get sold to systems integrators and then kind of move throughout the world. And that answer to, can we provide this kind of Rolodex of information based on provenance and turnover? I think what do they call it? Their word for it is different than supply chain custody, chain of custody. Same thing, right? Same concept. And the answer was actually no. In most cases, unless it's a massive company, that chain of custody is quite lost in reality. For different parts that get shipped out and then what touches them. And then from a cybersecurity perspective, I think we really are turning a corner on what is actually important in that chain of custody for cybersecurity. It's not like Tom, Dick, and Harry, cleaned it once, right? It's, updates and firmware and all of those things that actually matter for us. Can we track that, capture it, and then digest it in a way that's palatable for somebody to actually use that information, not just to say, yep, we have it.
Yeah. Right, which takes us right into our last question. And as we discussed, I think I've used the French Revolution. I mentioned on this episode already, but I've used it in the past. But again, I think we're playing out this long path. And you look at the entire stretch of human history. The answer was no, right? Most of human history has been empires and monarchies and so on and so forth. This whole self-assembling society thing is a relatively new idea, and where we're going with this quantity of data and practicality and everything else, I think policy, I think some technologies like oracles and so forth, and smart contracts, are specifically the things that work. But if not, whatever, the mechanism comes down to just better defining the relationship between two entities. Mm-hmm. Putting that better, providing the framework where any two or more entities can put together the framework and implement it, to better define and track their relationship. And it comes down to the human things like trust. I trust my business partners anyways. I mean, we went through all this time to have a partnership. We signed contracts. We had lawyers involved. We thought through different things. But, I can't really see what's going on. Right. So I think leaning even further into it, I think we see this in the SBOM world, where the vendors in the early POCs were saying, well, yeah, security, but I actually found out I had a better relationship with my customer and they trust me more because I told them I'd give them things and I actually gave them things. And they're like, wow, you gave me things. I guess I do trust you. I could probably sell things faster. Right. It's probably better for business. And, so the question is a bit jokey, but right. And the world affairs right now, we're in the middle of a conflict on every scale, military and cognitive and whatnot on this, democracy is faltering in places. Mm-hmm. Do you think all this, the practical reality, let me put it in a straight question, the practical reality, the economic reality of companies doing things that we're recommending in the security space, just being more profitable will continue to prove the point, right, and drag us forward.
Right. So that's truth is actually a cultural pillar in Nozomi Networks, and in technology we call it getting sticky, right? You don't want to be kicked out of the partnership, and so partnerships is a huge kind of strategic priority for companies like ours, right? And when we go into a customer, they say, well, who are your partners? Who do you work with? And we start to name drop the customers or the partners we have already built really good relationships with, and then that adds credibility. Right, when we go into an environment where we're having cyber physical systems, we're talking about securing something that's integral to a bottom line, but it's also integral maybe to a society or a workforce. So partners is really kind of how we see that coming up. But, in that broader kind of societal question, I think it's really interesting. I can't speak for the French because my family hasn't been there in so long. But in American politics, you really saw the kind of hijacking of individualism for a long time, and kind of playing people against each other or pitting companies even against each other on this kind of identity of individualism and I'm special and everyone's special. Then it went to identity politics, right? Which is, we talked about pendulum swings. And I think if that pendulum does come down for us in our field in any sense, it will be in masterful collaboration, right? Where you build trust and relationships and those things matter. That sounds a little hokey, but that's kind of what I believe to be true. It's kind of why I do make the choices that I do. You mentioned my background and my career a lot of the time, which is we want to trust that things work when we need them to work and that they're not going to be, surreptitiously manned when they shouldn't be operated, right? And so that's kind of back. I saw that Dick asked a question about my nuclear background. That was kind of what I loved in that sense, right? That's this kind of larger than life mission set. Mission creep happened along with politics in the nuclear policy world, right? And you see that across cybersecurity. And one of the nuclear oriented bylines that I wrote for, I think it was the national interest, I mentioned this, that we kind of had mission creep happen, but at the same time, we learned a lot of good lessons for security. And I also mentioned in there, it was a tiny little caveat, I think in the opening paragraph, that cybersecurity writ large, like as a field, is not regulated. If I were at a different company and I didn't build trust, I could sell you anything if you bought it, right? And I think that's also going to change, right? Once people start to say, well, this company has a ton of partnerships and I'm in an RFI and I'm going to compare them against another company and that company doesn't have any partnerships. They say they can do it all. And I look at their brief, right? And I read 7 pages and I can't figure out what they don't do. That's going to start to be a red flag for our community, I think, in the future. It's going to be all about the partnerships and who does what the best, right?
Yep. And you touched on ISACs, and we don't have time to get back into that. But, one of the premises that I've been thinking about that, from the beginning, 10, 15 years ago, is that we need lots, right? Just lots and lots, because you got to break communities down into enough chunks that we can all do things. And I think we're getting there. There are groups of information sharing organizations and multiple groups. There's probably groups of groups at this point.
Right.
And we mentioned the French a number of times. I got to give a call out to my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Minnie Gay, who was born as a Florida Panhandle sharecropper's daughter. And the Gay family goes all, gay streets across the South. You see them in downtowns. That's all my family back to 1640. It was originally a French family, right? Mm-hmm. So that's half of my family has followed that road, apparently. and it's and it's gone well so far, right? There's critical infrastructure, the lights are on, the water's flowing, systems are working. We've gone for a couple of years of crazy stress, but the things we've been building keep working.
Yes, a lot of stress.
It's a lot of stress.
But we should stress test, right? The chaos monkey model gets brought up a lot of times in the back channels of the ICS community of what's a good frame of reference, right, for stress testing. And I think we should be doing more of that. But something interesting I just thought of, and my background is when I was at Stanford, I was part of a project where a reinsurance group really wanted the formula for accumulation risk in cyber. And you could actually theoretically build the formula. We actually had the formula on the wall. You couldn't plug in the right data, right? And everyone understood that. And I think writ large, you're seeing technologists, cybersecurity folks, supply chain, SBOM leaders understand that accumulation isn't something we have to figure out to get other things right, to focus on stress testing, pen testing, understanding control systems, doing a better job of the not hyperbolic, kind of least sexy, most likely situations across ICS and critical infrastructure. And that's why I love the space that I'm in right now and kind of the time that we're in. I also have some homage on the French side. My grandfather's name was Duros, which is quite French. And I have an aunt who believes we were part of the aristocracy. So we can take that to the bank. I have never done the ancestry. I always mean to, but in a talk I gave a couple of years ago at the Cybersecurity Forum for Electric Utilities in Chicago, I actually broke down the energy industry in terms of the revolution and the Renaissance. And I've had a couple people say, I'm going to steal this from you. And so I pulled up the slides. And I used to say that when I talked about the energy in two camps, it's kind of like a Venn diagram. So energy and utilities were experiencing this revolution and the way that they connect and interact with the world. And we know from the French Revolution and other revolutions that the reason revolution is the reason for constant shift in society. And the takeaway there is that nothing will ever be done the same. I think what's happening in cybersecurity across our industry is actually a renaissance, not a revolution. And the difference being, Renaissance is a revolutionary period in history, but it's due to the far-reaching changes in art, politics, science, and technology, as well as religion. And so I joke with folks that we're actually changing our religion and how we look at ICS cybersecurity in a moment where a lot of different technology verticals are kind of in a revolution, right? They're never going to do anything the same. That's not true for us. There's a lot of things we're going to be doing the same. We just have to get smarter about our art and religion and how we do it. And that all comes down to economics and efficiency, and then everything we're willing to kind of trade for both. And those are the conversations we have with customers, right? So I love the revolution question.
Right. And ending on Renaissance, yeah, I couldn't agree more, right? It's emergent properties, sophisticated nuances, the obvious tropes, slippery slopes and so forth. Mm-hmm. Yes, if you published all of your software, bill of materials and everything you do on the internet and just said, we give up, then you'll probably go out of business. But that's maybe not, who knows?
Right.
But there are probably more nuanced ways to do this. And that's why
there are art forms, really. If we keep with the Renaissance, it's an art form, and how you build VEX data and how you integrate things and make use of it instead of just kind of compiling and storing a lot of data.
So. Yep. Awesome. Jabs, thank you so very, very much. It was so wonderful seeing you at S4.
Always, I know it's always so good to see you.
Human beings out in the world again. You're gonna be at RSA? I
I am. Yes, Monday night? I'll be at RSA, and I was showing off your motorcycle the other day from the picture you posted.
Yeah. Yeah.
I live with a vehicle buff. So.
450 Rebel is interesting. They actually caused a policy problem. The U.S. legislation was changed because Harley Davidson lost their mind. So they made the Honda made the 450 Rebel for 1 year. They made a 250 forever since, because they weren't allowed to, infringe on Harley Davidson.
And you still have both.
They still have both.
The motor and the boat. Yep.
Yep. All right.
Thanks for having me, and thanks all for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.